Hi everybody! We are in this series called Around the Table where we're looking through the book of John and seeing the feast of Jesus. And one of my favorite parts of this series is we're looking at recipes. And this week we have a special recipe, stuffed peppers, and I brought some professional sous chefs to help me. So let's go do it. You guys ready?
Yeah!
All right. First, you're gonna preheat the oven to 350 degrees, and then you're gonna get your rice ready and have it cooking. Next, you're gonna brown the meat and the onion all together, and you're gonna add your Italian seasoning. Now you're gonna add some yummy green hatch chilies and put some super authentic Hunt's tomato sauce in there. Now you're gonna add the rice mix. You only need a couple of servings, and then put some salt and pepper to taste. And now you just cut off the tops of the bell peppers, clean out the seeds. You can brush some olive oil inside and outside. Then you're gonna stuff the meat, and then cheese and layer, and cheese and meat and cheese, all the good stuff. And then you're just gonna bake it. Put it in the oven, and after 30 minutes, you will have delicious, authentic Italian stuffed peppers. This is a perfect food to invite your small group around the table and join in a feast with God.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry about the lights. It's a little bit dark in here. The good news is, unlike you said, actually, you can fall asleep because I can't see you. So just, you know what? If you've been wanting to doze off during the sermon for a while, this is the week for you. This is perfect. So don't worry about it. So as Juice mentioned, we're continuing in this Around the Table series that we've been doing. And we're going to be looking today at maybe one of the most famous of the meals that Jesus shared in the Bible. And it got me to thinking actually about how I started at Menlo Church, because it's actually kind of a crazy story. We moved to the Bay Area, Jonna and I did, about 5 years ago in 2017. It was actually Easter of 2017, so a 5-year anniversary of being up here in the Bay Area is coming up. And Jonna had gotten a job as the associate pastor at St. Timothy's Lutheran Church. And I was working still at Sierra Vista Presbyterian Church, which is the church I grew up at. And I was still trying to finish seminary. And so then once I moved up here, I had no idea what I was going to do. John and I had been praying about it, and she had gotten a job, but she was like, I feel like I'm dragging you out of this job that you loved, and I don't know what it is that you're going to do. How are you going to find your thing? And I was just like, I don't know. I just feel like God's going to figure this out. It's going to be okay. So I started looking for a job. And when I first got up here, we actually had an agreement when we both got up here. And that agreement was, we will not both pastor at different churches at the same time. We failed that really, really quickly. Or I should say, I failed at that really, really quickly. But I swear, as you're going to find out in a second, it is not my fault, okay? Because I got up here and I thought, well, you know what? Nonprofit work is perfect. I worked in politics, I did campaigning, so I had, some fundraising and kind of volunteer coordinating skill set. And then I also had a master's of divinity and a seminary degree, so I'm like, okay, well, that's great. I've got these two things. I can do ministry, I can do this other thing. So the nonprofit world seems perfect. So I started interviewing for all these nonprofit jobs, but nothing quite felt right. And then actually, a friend of ours from St. Timothy's Lutheran sent me a job link, or actually they sent me a link to Indeed.com, and they said, hey, put this in the search bar, and it was actually a job for Second Harvest Food Bank. And so I'm like, okay, so I get online, I put in this thing from Second Harvest Food Bank, and I go, and the Second Harvest Food Bank job description pops up, and it's the second link, but the first link is this job for a congregational care pastor at Menlo Church's Saratoga campus. And I was like, wait, what? The Saratoga campus? That's like right down the road. Like, isn't that like right over there? And then I was like, Menlo Church? Is that like Menlo Park Presbyterian Church? Is that what that is? Like John Ortberg's church? Is that right? Huh, okay. So I checked it out and I was like, man, that's the same denomination that I'm trying to become ordained in. That's crazy. That seems like an interesting coincidence. So I actually was so excited. I showed Jonna the job description, and I was like, you got to check this out. And I was like, I know it's a pastoral job. And I said I wouldn't do it, but just read the job description. And she was like, oh, man, this seems like the perfect job for you. This is exactly what you were doing at your last church. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to drive down to the church tomorrow. I'm just going to poke my head in and just go introduce myself. So I did. So in November of 2017, it was right after Thanksgiving, I drove over here. It was a rainy day, and I had no idea what I was doing. The office was actually under construction, and so I wandered around the campus, not knowing what I was doing, and I poked my head into Sherry's office at the preschool, and I said, hey, is there a church here? Is there a church office? Where is it? And she was like, yeah, I think they're in the fireside room. So I poked my head in the fireside room, and Kathy Chu, our former administrator, was sitting at a round table, and I just walked in and I said, hi, my name's Alek. I'm here to ask you about this job for the congregational care pastor. And she just looked perplexed, and she was like, okay, have you filled out an application? And I said, no, I didn't do that yet. I didn't get there. And she's like, all right, well, maybe you should go home and fill out an application. And I was like, got it. I'm going to go do that. So I did. I went home, I filled out the application. And a couple weeks later, I met with Pastor Scott, who many of you know. And after about 30 minutes, he just kind of shook his head and he said, Alek, I thought for sure we were going to be hiring somebody in their mid-70s who was retired to be our congregational care pastor. I did not think in a million years a 32-year-old guy who just graduated from seminary would want to come and be the congregational care pastor at this Saratoga campus. That's crazy. And he said, you know what? It just must be a God thing. And I think that he's right. And that's the thing about God sometimes. Sometimes he just does stuff that we don't expect. Things that are just hard to explain, that don't make any sense, that don't fit our version of what was going to happen. And so today, as we look at maybe the most famous of all of Jesus' miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, we're going to look at how God sometimes just does things that we don't expect. So, starting in John chapter 6, verse 1 through 15, it says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, it would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one of these to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? And Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And after the people saw the sign that Jesus had performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So let me set the scene here and provide a little context for the beginning of our story. Jesus has been traveling around the countryside, and he's been doing miracles. And because of all that he's done, he's gained a fair amount of notoriety. So people do what people always do. We go and we want to see the famous person, right? Like that was as true in Jesus' day as it is in ours. I am a huge basketball fan, and I'm a Sacramento Kings fan. And so when I watch basketball and I see Steph Curry or LeBron James, when I go to see the Kings play, I don't actually go to see any of the Kings play because none of them are famous and they're terrible. But Steph Curry and LeBron James are really, really good. And it's fun to go see them play. But that's what we do, right? We see famous people, and we're like, oh, wow, let's go see what they're going to do, because sometimes people can do amazing things. So as this crowd is forming, Jesus retreats up the mountain and sits down with the disciples. And verse 4 tells us that the Jewish Passover festival was near. Rabbi Nathan Goldberg gives us some indication of why John might have mentioned the Passover here when he notes that the Passover is the festival of freedom, and it takes place in the spring month of Nisan, which is between March and April, and it was a time where the Jewish community was meant to give relief and hope to those who were suffering. The ancient Jewish hope was that it would be during this Passover month that the people would be freed again. And actually, that's exactly what happened as Jesus was crucified at the beginning of the Passover week, about 2 years after this. And this is the first of 3 Passovers recorded by John. And so this is meant to prepare us for Jesus' ultimate deliverance, freedom, and hope, not only to the Jewish people, but for the entire world. So as Jesus is sitting with his disciples, he asks Philip a question. Where are we going to buy bread for all of these people? Now, this is a test, and Jesus already knows what he's going to do, but he's hoping that Philip will have some idea of what's going to happen next. Why Philip, you might ask? Well, Philip was actually just from the area, and presumably he knew the best places to go buy some bread. So Philip responds the way that I am positive that I would have responded to Jesus, by getting completely exasperated and going, are you serious? Come on, Jesus. It would take half a year's wages for every one of these people to have one bite. It's impossible. There was no planning here. How are we supposed to feed all these folks? Come on, Jesus. That's crazy. And at this point, Andrew speaks up, and he brings forward a boy who's got 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish. He's like, hey, I found this kid, and he's got a little bit of food. I guess it's something. But also, is this even useful? I don't know. I mean, it's a little something. So we know that this was a test, and if Jesus is the teacher, it's time to pass out some grades. Philip, he gets an F. He failed. He completely failed. He missed the point. He didn't understand what Jesus was doing. He just failed. Andrew, well, I don't know. He probably gets a C, because at least he found this little boy and brought him forward. It's not perfect, but he didn't fail either. And, at Chico State, we always used to say C's get degrees. So, Andrew's doing all right, I guess. So Jesus asks the disciples to get everyone seated, and the text says 5,000 men were there. So we can assume there were probably somewhere in the vicinity of 15,000 people if you include the women and the children. And he took the loaves and the fish, and he gave thanks, and he distributed them among the people. And there was much more than anyone could ever imagine. There was much as everyone wanted. And then after they had eaten, he asked the disciples to gather up all that is left. And there are 12 baskets overflowing with leftovers. Jesus doesn't just feed everyone. There is enough food left over so that the disciples have enough food for another week. When Jesus gives a blessing, it is abundant. It overflows. It's not just enough to satisfy us, it's enough to fill us up. And after the people saw the sign that Jesus had performed, they began to say that he must be the prophet, which Moses has actually talked about in the book of Deuteronomy, that this prophet was going to come after him. And Jesus, knowing that they mean to make him king by force, withdraws back up the mountain by himself. Now, the crowd here does exactly what we would expect them to do at first glance, right? I mean, what would you do if you saw a miracle? If you see a miracle happen, you're going to be like, that guy just performed a miracle? Let's hoist him on our shoulders. This guy, he must be really, really special. He should lead us now. That was amazing what he just did. And you might actually be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, aren't the people right? Isn't Jesus the king? And the answer is yes, Jesus is the king. But the issue that is at play here is not their impression of Jesus, it's their expression of what Jesus is going to do and how he's going to do it. You see, Jesus is not the kind of king or prophet that they think he is. And you may already know that, but we should have a little sympathy for the crowd here because we generally get Jesus wrong too, especially at first. Dale Bruner says that it is hard for us mortals to get Jesus right, so we must constantly relearn Jesus on his own terms. I want to repeat that. We have to relearn Jesus on his own terms. The thing that we tend to do is we take Jesus and we put Jesus and make him do things on our terms. Because we let our own biases and our own stuff gets mixed up with it. And then we want Jesus to do things the way we want, not the way Jesus actually does things. This relearning process is a lifelong course for disciples. And it's a course that never ends. We are almost always trying to find the most efficient route or the easiest route. And that, my friends, simply will not work. In fact, this assertion is backed up by the fact that the entire 6th chapter of John sees Jesus go from a crowd of thousands to a few verses later, a crowd of hundreds, and ultimately culminates in verse 66 with all of his disciples that had followed him. Because remember, there are a lot more than just the 12 leaving him, except for the 12. And honestly, not even the 12, because one of the 12 wasn't really on board with the plan either. And do you know why? It actually says at the end of chapter 6 that these disciples looked at Jesus and they said, Jesus, what you are asking is too challenging. Your teaching, it's too hard. This is way too hard. We can't do this. How can anybody do this? So I hope I've painted the picture that discipleship is not for the faint of heart. Which brings us to a man named Anatoly Berezhnyi. Now, you have probably never heard Anatoly's name in your life. But my guess is that after today's sermon, you are not going to forget his name, because Anatoly was a disciple of Jesus. So Anatoly lived with his wife in the Kyiv suburb of Irpin. And when Russia invaded the country about a month ago, he and his wife fled to the west so that they could get to safety. Just like Philip in our story, they did the logical thing. They were like, bad stuff's happening, we gotta get out of here. Makes sense. Millions of Ukrainians have been fleeing. So this 26-year-old and his wife were members of the Irpin Bible Church. And when he saw the devastation that was happening in his town, he left his wife and he went back to volunteer to help people evacuate the city. And he was at the church when Russian mortars began falling nearby. And he saw a woman named Tetiana Perabienis and her 2 children, Makita and Alyssa, struggling down the street with a couple of bags and their dog. His pastor, Mykola Romaniuk, said that without hesitation, he rushed out to help get this family to safety. And moments after reaching them, a mortar struck a few yards away, and Anatoly and the Perabienis family were killed. A New York Times photojournalist named Lynsey Addario happened to be across the street right as the shell struck. And she took a picture. And it has become the iconic image of this brutal, unjust war. Some of you, many of you, have probably seen this picture. When I saw it, it was so evocative that I just wanted to know more. I wanted to know who these people were. I had read in an article that the man in the photo was a volunteer from the local church. And I just had to find out more about this guy. Pastor Romaniuk said of Anatoly that he was the kind of friend who was willing to help without the need of words. And I don't know why, but that's the perfect description. sounds like a disciple. The loss of Anatoly and the Berezhnyi family and thousands of others is absolutely heartbreaking. And when we see these images, it makes us weep for the cruelty and the violence that human beings are capable of inflicting on one another. When I found out that Anatoly was a church volunteer, I have not been able to get his immense sacrifice out of my head. And maybe that's exactly the point. In preparation for today's sermon, it has me wondering about this little boy who brought the loaves and the fish to this gathering to see Jesus. When he woke up that morning, he probably knew he was going to see this guy named Jesus because Jesus had kind of become a local celebrity at that point. But there is no way he could have known that this man named Jesus had a role for him specifically to play in this miracle that he was going to perform. In fact, Scripture tells us Jesus knew exactly what he was going to do. So Jesus was thinking of this boy. Now, this boy wasn't unique. There were thousands of kids at this gathering. But he did do a couple things that we always have to remember ourselves to do as well. He showed up and he gave what he had. And because of those two simple acts, the entire world has heard that little boy's story millions of times over thousands of years. Think about that. Millions of times over thousands of years because he showed up and he gave what he had. The remarkable thing about Anatoly's story is that he showed up and he gave everything that he had. And I also think it's pretty safe to say he had enough faith in Jesus Christ to run out onto a war-torn street to help a family that he didn't even know. And he paid the ultimate price for his discipleship. Shortly after Luke's version of the feeding of the 5,000, he says something that's really, really hard for me to hear. And I wrestle with this passage because it's difficult. In Luke 9, verses 23 and 24, Jesus says, Then he said to them all, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will save it." And I want to make sure that you understand without a shadow of a doubt that picking up your cross daily and following Jesus means putting yourself at risk. It is hard. When Anatoly picked up his cross on that faithful day a few weeks ago, he joined Jesus on a cross right beside him. In our American culture, we are rarely faced with this choice. But for others around the world, picking up the cross literally means giving the very last breath in their lungs. And as we are moving through this Lenten season in preparation for Jesus' death on the cross and ultimately his resurrection, it is important to remember that death is never the end of the story. It was not for Jesus, and guess what? It's not the end of the story for Anatoly either. I guarantee you that a month ago, he would have never believed that a pastor half a world away at a church in Saratoga, California, would be telling his story. That's pretty remarkable. But friends, that is exactly what Jesus does. As the worship song says, he makes beautiful things out of us. Out of tragedy, and out of heartbreak, and out of devastation, out of a life cut much too short, Jesus brings hope and inspiration and shining example. So that's pretty heavy. So what on earth do we do now? we are not in the middle of a war zone. That is not where you are called to be right now. But make no mistake, each and every one of you are called to something. Anatoly had great faith, and I have to be honest, I'm not sure mine compares with his. But that's okay, because we are all on this faithful journey together. Some of you are just starting out on the journey. And for you, maybe the next step into discipleship looks like giving to our emergency relief fund for Ukraine and supporting all the different humanitarian efforts and churches in that country. Maybe it looks like jumping into our next Serve Your City event. Maybe you've been at this journey for a little bit longer and you want to go a little bit deeper. And maybe you want to join one of our teams here at Menlo Church. You want to join the Connections team or the Kids team. Now, some of you may think that joining the Kids team feels a little bit like a battlefield. But I assure you, it's not quite that crazy. And the truth is, we've got some amazing kids at this church, and they need your love and guidance and instruction. Maybe that's where Jesus is calling you. Or maybe you've been at this journey for a long time, and God is calling you into something a little bit more unique. Maybe something that God's been preparing you for your entire life. On Thursday, the United States announced that we're going to be receiving 100,000 refugees into our country. And the city of Saratoga is actually looking to find people who might be able to house these displaced folks or help to provide resources to get them settled. That's a big thing. That's a huge commitment. But I've got great news. We worship a big God who can do anything and then do it overflowing with abundance. As I reflect back on our passage, I'm struck by the fact that while basically everyone in this story, with the possible exception of the boy, fails to see Jesus for who he is and understands what he is doing, Jesus still invites their participation into the miracle that takes place. The crowd thinks that Jesus is the type of king whom they'll need to hoist on their shoulders so he can lead them to battle and free them from their Roman oppressors. Which is wrong. That's not what Jesus came to do at all. Yet he feeds them anyway, because they are hungry, and Jesus cares about our physical needs. The disciples fail to realize that Jesus can feed thousands with a few loaves and a couple fish. Yet in verse 10, he asks them to seat the people. Because while they don't understand what's happening, Jesus wants their participation in performing the miracle anyway. Even when we misunderstand what Jesus is asking of us, he still allows us to be a part of the equation. We get to participate in the miracle even when we completely fail to see what Jesus is doing. Why? Because this is the way of Jesus Christ. It doesn't always make logical, worldly sense, but the way of the world often doesn't make kingdom sense. It is so easy to be like Philip in our story, to look at a big problem, to look Jesus right in the face and say, "This isn't possible. What are you asking of me? I don't get it. How can you do this? Look at the facts, Jesus. We can't do this. This doesn't make any sense." And I know for me that the next time that I have that thought, I'm going to think about Anatoly. Anatoly Berezhnyi, who was a disciple of Jesus, who had the faith to pick up his cross and carry it out into that street, because in that moment, the Perebianis' family's life was worth sacrificing his for. Because even in the deepest, darkest, hardest places, Jesus Christ's light will always shine. So take the next step on your journey. Ask God what that step is, and then listen, and then most importantly, obey. Be open to the possibility that God is going to use you in a way that might not make any sense, but that is going to change the world. That's what God did with Anatoly. He didn't know what his sacrifice meant when he made it, but I do now, and you do as well. That is what discipleship is about. That's what service in the kingdom of God looks like. We just have to believe that it's possible. Let's pray. Holy God, I just thank you so much for the life of Anatoly Berezhnyi, and for the fact that while his life was cut way too short, we get to know his story. And that his life meant something big. So Lord, I just pray this morning that for each and every one of us, you would show us, illuminate for us the next step on our journey, so that we may serve out of a place that is deeply rooted in you, in the faith that you can do anything. And that out of small things, you can perform big miracles. In your Son, Jesus Christ's name, amen.